Addison had shut her eyes to avoid being temporarily blinded by the bright light, much like seeing spots after looking directly at the sun. She'd opened them to see who had come through the door. She sat there, dumbfounded and dubious, as someone unexpected crossed the threshold. She frowned.
Grayson?
Yes, it was him. Her eyes weren't playing tricks on her, much like they had on at least one occasion. The hallucination she'd had 4 months ago of the boy in her doorway flashed through her mind for a fraction of a moment. But Grayson was real, and he was here, in her building. It wasn't a scenario that had crossed her mind before. Hadn't she just left him at the store? What was he doing here? He stood silent and still for a moment before he spoke.
You forgot this.
He held a dark blue hooded sweater in his hands. She stared, confused. As if she'd been zoning out, she shook her head when she realized he had been the one behind her outside. He'd followed her to return something she should have remembered. She felt a little foolish at her own forgetfulness, and yet intrigued at his unexpected thoughtfulness. Who knew?
Oh, thanks.
She paused for a second, unsure of what to say. The frown faded from her face and was replaced with quiet surprise.
You didn't have to follow me to give it back. I could have just gotten it the next time I was in.
She gave a small, appreciative smile as he handed the shirt to her. He shrugged and said,
I don't mind.
As he handed her the shirt, their eyes connected for the first time since they'd met, and she felt taken aback by the color she saw there. His eyes were a light blue, so light they were almost white, but a contrasting ring of deep blue outlined his irises. They complemented his ash blonde hair amazingly well, and for a fleeting instant she wondered if he wore contacts to achieve the effect. Surely no one's eyes could be that color naturally. She realized she was scrutinizing his eyes a little longer than was deemed appropriate between two virtual strangers. She pulled her sweater from his hand. If he'd noticed her appraisal, he didn't show it. He gave her a small smile, startling her once again. She didn't even know he could smile, let alone at her. He turned toward the door, offering a nod before stepping through the threshold and out into the morning light. She watched the door close behind him, the sunlight engulfing him in light so thick she couldn't see beyond the initial rays penetrating the door. She stood, frowned once more, and climbed the remaining steps. She reached the top of the stairs and stepped a few more feet to her apartment door.
Strange,
she commented quietly to herself as she unlocked the door and stepped inside. Naomi stood at the kitchen sink filling water bottles. She glanced over as Addison made her way into the living room and plopped down onto the worn-out couch. You're late. Naomi finished the bottles and placed them in the fridge next to several containers of pig's blood. She shut the door and sat down next to Addison on the couch. Addison laid her head back on the backrest and looked at the ceiling. She sighed deeply. Naomi watched her expectantly. So?
Was unexpectedly detained.
Meaning?
Grayson followed me home,
she said, bewildered. Oh? Naomi replied. Intrigue filled her eyes.
He brought me my sweatshirt.
Huh?
I forgot my blue hoodie at work.
She held up the shirt. So what? He followed you to give it back?
Guess so.
She dropped her hand back to the couch. That's weird.
I think he was just trying to be nice.
She frowned again. Maybe that's all there was to it, just a thoughtful gesture. She honestly couldn't tell. Possibly. Or maybe he wanted to see where you lived so he could stalk you later. Naomi smirked.
Yes, I'm sure that's exactly what he was doing,
Addison mocked. Who knows? Maybe he has a thing for you and just can't express it like a normal person. Maybe this, she gestured toward Addison's shirt, is his way of showing it. Addison rolled her eyes.
I highly doubt that. And even if it were remotely possible, which I'm sure it's not, it would be one of the worst things he could do. I'm not someone he should want to cozy up to.
Naomi shrugged. It's not like he would know any better. I mean, why would he see you as anything but human?
I don't think it would take much,
Addison replied, thinking about how her skin alone would make anyone suspicious if they touched her, not to mention her avoidance of sunlight.
Besides, she continued, he rarely even acknowledges me when we work together. I don't think he even realizes I'm there half the time.
Oh, come on, Naomi sighed, sounding exasperated. You think he hasn't noticed you? Any man with a pulse is bound to. Hell, women too.
It's not that.
Then what?
I don't know, Addison hedged. He just seems so
She held up her hands as she searched for the right word.
withdrawn. It's like he only focuses inward.
Maybe he's just not a people person, Naomi offered. A grin spread across her face then. Says something about us then, doesn't it? She snickered. Addison scoffed.
Yeah, well, we have a reason to avoid people.
Naomi shrugged. True, though I do wonder sometimes, she eyed Addison, how much better it is than pig blood. Addison stared at the ceiling without reply. Well, Naomi said after a few moments of silence, I think he has a thing for you. Following you home to give you something you forgot? Sounds like something I would do for someone I liked, she said matter-of-factly.
You've never liked anyone for as long as I've known you.
Addison rolled her head to the side to look at her friend. No, not while you've known me. But as a human, I was terrible. Pretty much boy crazy. Naomi smirked at her memories. Addison smiled as she rolled her eyes and pushed herself up. Standing, she stretched and walked past the kitchen to her room down the short hall. We're going out tonight, Naomi called from the living room.
Naomi?
Addison said in warning. Resistance is futile, Addie. She was right. It didn't matter what excuse Addison came up with. Naomi didn't give up until she got her way. Addison threw herself onto her bed and buried her face in the pillow.
I hate you,
she mumbled through the stuffing. I know, Naomi mocked as she passed Addison's open door on her way to her own room.
Aren't you supposed to work tonight?
Addison asked, her face still buried in her pillow. I can if I want. Mac gave me the option.
You'll have more fun at work than you will dragging me out somewhere. Plus, you'd be getting paid.
Naomi peeked her head around the doorframe. Some things are more important. Her voice held a devious tone. Addison could only imagine what Naomi had in mind. The blinds throughout the apartment were open, but the sun was on the opposite side of the building. Nonetheless, they'd placed a specialized film over the windows to prevent the deadly UV rays from entering the apartment. The light still came in, but the women were left unharmed. It allowed them to experience at least some aspect of the sun. A strange habit for their kind, but they were eccentric anyway. Addison found the irony something of a comfort. She emerged from her room and went into the bathroom to shower. They typically never used hot water for anything. It cut down on the bills by quite a bit. But on occasion, Addison took hot showers. It was one of the few ways she knew of to warm her body. Contrary to the popular belief she'd heard over the years, vampire skin wasn't ice cold. The misconception was because they were seen as walking corpses, having no heartbeat and therefore no life. But that wasn't the case. The transition was more like a mutation. The heart still beat, but much slower and lighter than a human's. Any person looking to find a pulse wouldn't be able to. It was far too faint and much weaker than a normal person's. The strong flow of blood in the human body produced the heat. Without the strength of that flow, the body cooled. Addison didn't need to warm herself for any reason other than the desire to. She was completely comfortable at a lower temperature. But when she did warm her body, she felt that she was as close to being human as she would ever be again. Just as she'd learned the truth about the heartbeat, she'd found out that emotions remained with the person when they transitioned. If a newly changed vampire were allowed to develop naturally, not that vampires were considered natural under any circumstance, they would retain the same emotions they'd had when they were human. Or at least that was the theory. Since the only vampires Addison and Naomi knew of resided within the Union space, natural development rarely occurred. The leaders of the Union, Brisha and Jaren, were fond of using brainwashing techniques as a way to scrub out any residing human emotions. It was their way of establishing dominance over their subordinates. Some were able to resist the programming. Most couldn't. Addison had been one of the few to hold on to the only human part she had left. She guarded it fiercely, and no matter how hard the Union had tried, they'd been unable to break her. Naomi, on the other hand, had never been exposed to the Union or its practices. She'd been allowed to develop without interference, yet she seemed less willing to maintain her human aspects. Addison had expected Naomi to loathe her existence, what she'd been turned into. Most did at first. On the contrary, Naomi had readily accepted it, more than Addison would ever be able to. When she would bring up the topic, Naomi would simply shake her head and say that she wasn't human anymore, and she wasn't going to pretend for her own sake. But sometimes Addison wondered if Naomi truly believed that. In public, neither of them had a choice. If the world knew that vampires really existed, there would be disbelief, panic, and undoubtedly violence on both sides. Violence had plagued Addison throughout her entire existence, both as a human and after. Just being what she was served as a constant reminder of that violence, of the pains she and those she'd known had endured. As much as she wanted to forget the past, she couldn't. It was where she lived now and always. According to Naomi, living in the past was a human trait. Addison took it as a compliment. She finished her shower and flopped onto her bed after drying off. Wearing nothing, she pulled the covers over herself and stared at the ceiling. She lay there for hours, thinking about Grayson's unexpected visit. Buried in her thoughts, she eventually drifted off to sleep. The sun shone brightly on the world, shielding those within its rays that were vulnerable in its absence. He knew humanity was safe for another day. He could rest for now, for when the sun set, he would take its place as protector once more. When Addison woke hours later, she noticed that a strange fog had settled in her room. Feeling the damp chill in the air, she lifted her head and saw that her door was closed. She frowned. She usually left it open when she and Naomi slept, a precaution in case someone broke in. She pitied anyone who would be that stupid. She wrapped a thin sheet around her body and moved to the door. When she grasped the knob, she wasn't able to turn it. Strange. It was locked. She didn't even know the door had a lock. She squatted down and peered at the fixture. She couldn't find a latch or a lock anywhere on the knob, or the door for that matter. She stood and tried to open it again. Still, she couldn't turn the knob. Baffled, she tried to figure out why the door wouldn't budge. Suddenly it clicked. It was like a light bulb had been switched on above her head, just like in cartoons. Someone was on the other side of the door, holding it shut. Naomi wouldn't have any reason to be fooling around with Addison. Someone else had to be in the apartment. She jerked her hand from the knob like she touched something hot. She stepped back quietly toward the bed as an instinctive fear crept over her. She continued backward until she reached the bed and climbed to the center of the mattress. She closed the sheet in front of her and held her breath. For a minute, nothing happened. The silence in the room suddenly seemed loud, overbearing, and her ears started to ring. Then the door began to open. Painfully slow. It seemed as if it took minutes for the door to open mere inches. She couldn't move. Something deep and primal held her in place, leaving her only to watch what was happening. Suddenly the door swung open all the way, revealing who was on the other side. A woman. Definitely not Naomi. Looking closer through the haze in the dim light of the room, Addison was able to make out sharp features and the blackest eyes she'd ever seen. There was something familiar about them, something old, dangerous. At the sight of those eyes, Addison could have sworn her heart stopped beating. Brescia. Addison had hoped never to come face to face with this woman, this creature, this thing ever again. They'd obviously been looking for her all this time. She was crazy for having thought she could escape without them finding her. They didn't tolerate insubordination, and anyone who attempted to leave was marked for death. Her time had come. She knew it, had known it all along. Was this why she was compelled to return? Was it her fate to die at the hands of the Union? She felt certain it was so. But surprisingly, Brescia was there to do the job herself, a true testament to just how much they hated her. All Addison could do was sit there and let her imminent fate creep up and overtake her. Brescia's black eyes focused on Addison. She stood as if she were made of stone, cemented in place.
How did you find me?
Addison managed to whisper around the lump in her throat. Brescia continued to stare at Addison as she abandoned her stone-like appearance and raised one of her arms, fingers held out in waiting. Addison's gaze was drawn down to the sheet that closed in front of her. She was stunned when she saw the sheet was no longer white, but rather some dark color she couldn't make out in the room's dim light. A faint yet familiar scent batted at Addison's nose. Her surprise turned to confusion. The sheet wasn't just a different color. It was stained, and from what she could feel against her skin, the stain was fresh with warmth and moisture. An alarm went off in her head as she put the smell and the feel of the damp fabric together. Blood. But whose? Blood almost black in color had soaked the sheet down to the mattress. The confusion gave way to horror as Addison turned her gaze back to Brescia. Her breath caught in her throat, and she felt herself cough and choke when she saw a living, beating heart in Brescia's outstretched hand. Her breathing suddenly became haggard, her lungs constricting. Something was wrong. Her mind raced for something, anything to help her think clearly, to figure out what was happening, what she should do next. But wherever her mind turned, a blank wall blocked her inner pleas for help. The more blank walls she ran into, the more desperate she became to avoid the truth that she wouldn't allow herself to acknowledge. But the truth wouldn't allow her denial for a moment longer. The heart was hers. Before Addison could let out so much as a whisper, Brescia closed her hand around the soft tissue. In front of Addison's eyes, it dried to a shell instantly and burst into ash in the grip of its captor. The ash that was once Addison's heart suddenly swelled into a suffocating cloud that engulfed the entire room, causing her to choke on her own remains. The toxic cloud filled her lungs and removed all the breath from her body. She felt herself fade from life and time itself, until all that was left was darkness.